Your neighbor's power bank in the garage cost him $1,200, takes up half a shelf, and still needs a full day to fully charge before a single storm. He bought it after the last blackout, convinced that bigger meant safer. Then a tree came down on the line 2 towns over. The power stayed off for 6 hours, and his freezer kept running fine. But so would have a system a tenth the price, because the freezer never needed $1,200 worth of battery in the first place. It just needed enough. That's the part almost nobody tells you when you start looking into backup power. The size of the system and the size of the problem are 2 completely different numbers, and most of what you're sold is priced around the first one, not the second. Travel to the countryside outside Kyoto, and you'll find the second number instead. Small fishing shacks along the coast. One-room tea processing sheds tucked into hillside terraces. Mountain cabins 2 hours from the nearest town by gravel road. None of them have a wall of batteries. Most of them have one panel, one small battery about the size of a car battery, and a single job that battery is responsible for keeping alive. A radio, a row of LED lights, a well pump, that's it. And that one job keeps running, reliably, for years, through typhoon season and winter alike, without anyone monitoring an app or worrying about a warranty. The reason this works comes down to a question Japanese engineers have been asking for generations, mostly because they've had to. Japan imports the overwhelming majority of the fuel that keeps its economy running. It has almost no domestic oil or gas of its own, and every energy shock the country has lived through has forced the same follow-up question: how do we do more with what little we have? You can see the answer everywhere. In cars built to travel further on less fuel, in homes built to waste no square foot, in appliances engineered to sip electricity instead of gulping it. Solar power, when it reached rural Japan, absorbed that same instinct. Instead of asking how much electricity a system could generate, the question became how little a system actually needed to generate to do its one job well. That question became urgent, not theoretical, after March of 2011. When the earthquake and tsunami knocked out power across huge stretches of the country, the failure wasn't really about how much electricity existed. Japan's grid was, and still is, enormous. The failure was about dependence on one single system with no fallback. When that one system went down, everything tied to it went down with it. In the months that followed, small, self-contained solar setups started appearing in homes and workshops that had never considered off-grid power before. Not because people wanted to unplug from the grid entirely, but because they'd learned, the hard way, that the things that mattered most, a light, a radio, a way to charge a phone, shouldn't be hostage to a single point of failure. That lesson is the entire foundation of the system we're building today. It isn't a scaled-down version of a whole house solar installation. It's a different kind of thinking altogether, built around a single, sharp question. What is the one thing in your home that, if it kept running no matter what happened outside, would actually change how safe and prepared you felt? For some people, that's a string of lights. For others, it's a router and a phone charger. For a lot of people in rural Japan, historically, it's been a well pump or a radio. The device matters less than the principle behind picking it. You're not trying to power a house, you're trying to protect one job. What makes this approach different from almost everything sold as backup power in stores right now is how deliberately small it stays. A single small solar panel, a charge controller sized to match it, not oversized just in case. One compact battery, sized to the actual job, not to an imagined worst case that will probably never happen. No inverter, in the version we're building today, because the job we're protecting runs on DC power directly, which, as you'll see, is most of what actually needs backup power in a home anyway. That combination is what gets the entire system down to right around $199. Built from 4 parts, assembled in under an hour, with nothing plugged into your home's wiring and nothing requiring anyone's permission but your own. It's worth being upfront about what this system is and isn't. The same way it's worth being upfront about any tool before you build with it. This is not a whole house backup system. It will not run your refrigerator, your air conditioner, or your washing machine. If a hurricane knocks out power to your entire home for a week, and your goal is keeping every appliance in the house running as if nothing happened, this build isn't that. And no amount of clever wiring turns $199 into a whole house solution. That's simply not what this component budget buys, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you something. What this system is built to do, and what it does exceptionally well, is keep one meaningful thing running continuously for years. Through outages, through winter, through days you never see coming. On a battery small enough to sit on a shelf, and a panel small enough to mount without scaffolding. That's the real difference between the Japanese approach to small solar and the version most companies market in the West. The Western pitch is almost always about scale. More panels, more storage, more independence from the grid entirely, priced accordingly. The rural Japanese approach, shaped by decades of having to make do with less, asks a smaller, more honest question first. What actually needs to keep running? And what's the leanest, most durable way to make sure it does? Once you start asking that question, instead of how big a system can I afford, the entire cost of solar changes, and a functioning, years-long backup system suddenly looks a lot more like $199 than $1,999. Over the rest of this video, we're going to build exactly that system. 4 components, real prices, wired together safely, sized for a job that actually matters in most homes. And we're going to be honest at every step about what it can do, what it can't, and why that honesty is the whole point of building something that's meant to last for years instead of ending up back in a box in the garage after one disappointing storm. There's one more idea worth sitting with before we get to parts and prices, because it's the thing that actually explains the keeps running for years part of today's title, not just the $199 part. Most people assume cheap and durable are opposites, that if something costs less, it must be cutting corners somewhere that will eventually show up as a failure. That assumption is true of a lot of products, but it isn't true of a correctly sized solar system, and understanding why is the difference between building something that lasts a decade and building something that quietly disappoints you in year 2. A system fails early for one of 2 reasons almost every time. Either a component was pushed harder than it was rated for, or a component was left exposed to conditions it wasn't built to handle. Neither of those has anything to do with the size of the system. A tiny, well-matched setup that never asks its battery to discharge past what it's rated for, never asks its panel to feed more current than its wiring can safely carry, and stays protected from moisture and heat, will comfortably outlast an oversized system where components are mismatched, corners were cut on wiring, or the battery gets run down further than it should be on a regular basis. Longevity comes from matching, not from size. That's the quiet principle behind every long-running small system you'll find tucked into a Japanese fishing shed or mountain workshop. And it's the same principle we're going to follow, part by part, starting now. Keep that principle in mind as we move into the build, because every choice from here forward, the size of the panel, the rating of the controller, the capacity of the battery, is going to be made against that standard. Not what's the biggest we can fit in the budget, but what's the smallest, best matched setup that will still be doing its job without complaint 5, 8, 10 years from now. Let's start with the actual parts list, because $109 only means something once you see exactly what it buys and why each piece was sized the way it was. The first component is the solar panel. And for this build, we're using a single 100-watt monocrystalline panel, which typically runs between $70 and $90 depending on the retailer and whether you catch it on sale. This is the same size panel that shows up in a lot of small off-grid builds, and there's a reason it keeps showing up. 100 watts is enough to fully recharge a modestly sized battery over the course of a normal day, even accounting for cloudy stretches and shorter winter daylight, without being so large that you're paying for capacity the rest of the system can't use anyway. Monocrystalline is worth the small premium over polycrystalline here, because it performs meaningfully better in low light, which matters most on exactly the kind of overcast day this system needs to prove itself. The second component is the charge controller, and this is the piece that's easiest to underestimate because it's the smallest and cheapest part on the table, usually $15 to $20 for a basic PWM controller. Its job has nothing to do with generating power and everything to do with protecting the battery from the power that's already being generated. Left unmanaged, a solar panel will keep pushing current into a battery long after that battery is full, and repeated overcharging is one of the fastest ways to shorten a battery's usable life, sometimes cutting years off it. The controller sits between the panel and the battery, and tapers that charging current down as the battery approaches full, then stops it entirely, the same way it opens the gate back up when the battery needs it. For a system this size, a basic PWM controller does this job perfectly well. An MPPT controller will harvest a little more power on cloudy days, but it typically adds another $15 to $25 to the build, which is budget better spent elsewhere at this scale. The third component, and the one that actually determines whether this system earns its keeps homes running for years claim, is the battery. This is where the Japanese-influenced approach to small solar diverges hardest from the bigger systems most people picture when they hear solar backup. Instead of a large 100 amp-hour battery sized to run several appliances for hours, this build uses a smaller 12-volt, 20 amp-hour lithium iron phosphate battery, Li-Fi-PO4, which typically runs between $75 and $95. That capacity sounds modest next to the massive battery banks in most solar marketing. And it is modest, deliberately. It's sized to the one job this system is protecting, not to an imagined worst case. Li-Fi-PO4 chemistry is worth specifying by name here rather than settling for a generic lithium battery, because it's meaningfully more stable and safer than the lithium-ion chemistry used in a lot of cheaper power banks, and it's rated for thousands of charge cycles rather than the few hundred you'd get out of a basic lead-acid battery, which is the actual mechanism behind a battery that's still working well after 5 or 8 years instead of needing replacement in year 2. The fourth and final major decision in this build is what we're not buying, an inverter. This build is designed to power a DC load directly. LED lighting, a DC-powered radio, a router running off a DC adapter, a small fan, a phone charging setup, rather than a standard AC household appliance. Skipping the inverter removes another $40 to $60 from the build and removes a point of failure at the same time, since inverters are one of the more failure-prone components in a small solar system, especially cheaper ones. If your one protected job genuinely needs standard AC power, that's a valid build too, but it's a different, slightly more expensive one, and it's worth being honest that adding a decent pure sine inverter will generally push this system closer to $250 to $260 rather than $199. The version we're walking through today is the DC Direct build, because for most of the jobs worth protecting in a home, lighting, communication, a well pump, a security camera, DC power is not a compromise, it's simply the correct tool. Added up, a 100-watt panel around $80, a PWM controller around $18, a 20-ampere Li-Fi-PO4 battery around $85, and wiring, connectors, fuses, and mounting hardware typically running $15 to $20 for a build this size. That lands right around $199 to $210, depending on where you're shopping, which is the honest range behind today's number rather than a rounded-down marketing figure. Now for the wiring, and this is the part where care matters more than speed. Mount the panel where it gets the most consistent daily sun, south-facing in the northern hemisphere, tilted roughly to your latitude for a good year-round average. Run the wire from the panel down to the charge controller first. Never connect a panel directly to a battery. Connect the panel's leads to the controller's input terminals, matching positive to positive and negative to negative. Reversed polarity here can damage the controller immediately, so check twice before anything is powered on. From the controller's battery terminals, run a fused line to the battery itself, again matching polarity exactly. Finally, run your load, whatever DC device you're protecting, off the controller's dedicated load terminals if it has them, which lets the controller also protect your device from over-discharging the battery too far, extending both the battery's life and your device's runtime during an extended outage. Every one of those connections needs a properly sized fuse, placed close to the source it's protecting. One between the panel and the controller, sized to the panel's rated output, and one between the controller and the battery, sized to the controller's maximum output current. For a system this size, that generally means a wire gauge in the 12 to 14 AWG range, and fuses rated modestly above the actual expected current draw, never far above it. A fuse size too large stops protecting the wiring it's supposed to protect. This isn't the place to reuse whatever spare wire happens to be in a drawer. Undersized wire on a DC circuit heats up under load, and heat in wiring, even on a small system like this one, is how electrical fires start. And it's worth saying this plainly. Separate from the excitement of a $199 price tag, this project involves live DC electrical connections, and while a small, correctly fused system like this one is generally low risk, mistakes with wiring, polarity, or fusing can still cause damage or fire. If you're integrating this into your home's existing wiring in any way, or you're not confident reading a basic wiring diagram, bring in a licensed electrician for that part of the job. A build being simple and inexpensive doesn't mean the electrical safety rules get to be optional. It's also worth translating 100 watts and 20 amp hours into something you can actually picture, because the numbers on a spec sheet don't mean much until you know what they add up to in real use. A 100-watt panel, on a decent sunny day, will typically deliver somewhere in the range of 350 to 450 watt-hours of usable energy once you account for morning and evening angles, not just the theoretical peak at noon. A 20 amp-hour battery at 12 volts holds roughly 240 watt-hours of usable capacity when you respect a reasonable depth of discharge rather than draining it completely, which you should always do with any battery chemistry if you want it to last. Put those two numbers together, and on most days this system produces meaningfully more than the battery needs to stay topped off, which is exactly the point. The battery isn't there to store a full day's surplus. It's there to smooth out the gap between when the sun is shining and when your one protected device actually needs power, including straight through the night and into the next morning before the panel starts producing again. That margin is also what gives this system its resilience during a multi-day stretch of bad weather, which is the scenario most people actually worry about when they picture a real outage. On a heavily overcast day, that same 100-watt panel might produce a third of its clear day output rather than none at all. Solar panels still generate meaningfully under cloud cover, just at a reduced rate, which means even a run of gray days rarely drops this system to zero. It simply reduces the daily top-up until the sun returns. That's a very different failure mode than a system with no solar input at all. And it's the reason a correctly sized $199 setup can genuinely claim to keep something running for years, not just for one good afternoon. That's the complete parts list and the wiring path for a system built to protect one meaningful job in your home, quietly, for years, without a monthly bill or a service call. In the final part, we'll walk through exactly what to power with it, how to think honestly about what deserves that protection, and what this build simply isn't built to do. With the system wired and running, the real question isn't technical anymore. It's a question of judgment. What, specifically, deserves a spot on 240 watt-hours of daily battery capacity in your home? That's a smaller number than most solar marketing wants you to think about, and treating it honestly is what separates a system you'll actually rely on for years from one that quietly disappoints you the first time you ask too much of it. Start with communication, because it's the category most people underestimate until they're standing in a dark house wishing they hadn't. A DC-powered router and modem draw very little continuous current, often just a few watts, which means this system can keep a household connected to the internet through an extended outage using only a small slice of its daily capacity. Pair that with a phone charging setup, and you've covered the single most requested feature during any real blackout: the ability to actually reach people and find out what's happening, for a fraction of what this system can provide. Lighting is the second obvious candidate, and it's the one that shows up in nearly every version of this build across rural Japan, for a simple reason. LED lighting is remarkably efficient, and a handful of rooms lit through a full evening barely dents a battery this size. This isn't about running your home's normal lighting circuit. It's about a dedicated string of LED fixtures or a few battery-backed lamps wired to this system specifically, so that when the grid goes down, you're not standing in the dark looking for a flashlight with a dead battery of its own. Water is the third category worth naming specifically, because it's the one that gets overlooked until it's the only thing that matters. A small DC well pump or a low-flow water pump pulling from a rain barrel or cistern draws modest, intermittent current, running for a minute or two, then resting, which is exactly the rhythm a small battery handles well. If your home depends on a well pump during an outage, this is very often the single highest value job to protect with a system like this, ahead of lighting, ahead of communication, because it's the one thing on this list that genuinely can't be replaced with a flashlight or a phone call. Security and monitoring round out the list well. A DC-powered security camera or a basic alarm system draws very little continuous power and matters most precisely during the kind of extended outage that also tends to leave homes unattended or vulnerable. Keeping that one camera running through a multi-day outage is a small, specific job this system handles easily, without needing to stretch its capacity anywhere near its limit. Now for the honest part. The part that matters as much as anything we've built so far. This system will not run your refrigerator. It will not run a standard household air conditioner, a space heater, an electric stove, or anything else that pulls hundreds of watts continuously. Those loads belong to a much larger, much more expensive system, and no amount of careful wiring turns a 20 amp-hour battery into something it isn't. If your instinct after finishing this build is to try running something well outside its capacity, the result won't be a system that struggles along at reduced performance. It'll be a battery discharged far past where it should be, shortening its life dramatically, or a controller shutting the load off entirely to protect itself, which is the controller doing exactly its job at exactly the wrong moment for you. Knowing the honest ceiling of a system like this before you build it is what keeps you from feeling let down by it later, and it's the same discipline that keeps small solar systems across rural Japan running reliably for a decade, instead of being abandoned in a shed after one disappointing winter. There's also an honest word to say about time. Keeps homes running for years is true of the components in this build. A quality live FP04 battery is commonly rated for 2,000 to 3,000 charge cycles before its capacity noticeably declines, which at roughly 1 cycle a day translates to somewhere in the range of 6 to 8 years of daily use before you'd expect to consider a replacement. And the panel itself will still be producing the large majority of its original output well beyond that. But years here means years of reliable service from a correctly sized, correctly protected job, not years of zero attention. Twice a year, wipe dust off the panel, since even a light film measurably reduces output on a system with no capacity to spare for waste. Once a season, check that the connections at the controller haven't loosened from vibration or temperature swings, and confirm the fuses are still the correct rating, rather than upsized just because they kept tripping. A fuse that trips repeatedly is telling you something is drawing more than it should, and the answer is finding that cause, never installing a bigger fuse to make the warning go away. If this system earns its place in your home protecting one job well, the natural next step isn't to make this one bigger, it's to build a second one, separate and independent, for the next job that matters. A panel and controller and battery for the well pump this year. A second small setup for a workshop or a shed next year. Size to that job specifically, rather than folded into one larger, more fragile system. Each stays independent. Each keeps working, even if another eventually needs a part replaced. And each one costs a fraction of what trying to build one system to do everything would have cost from the start. That's the same principle that's kept small solar setups running quietly across rural Japan for decades. One well-matched job at a time. And it's the principle this entire build has been built around from the first component to the last. Before you go, tell me which job in your home this would protect first. Is it the well pump, the router, and a few phone chargers, a string of lights through the hallway, or something else you've been quietly worried about the next time the power goes out? Let me know in the comments, and if you're unsure whether a specific device would fit inside this system's capacity, ask down there too. I read every comment, and those questions are usually exactly what shapes the next build on this channel. One last thought before you head off to shop for parts. It's tempting, once you understand how this system works, to immediately start planning a bigger version. 2 panels instead of 1, a larger battery, an inverter added in, so you can run just one more thing. There's nothing wrong with that instinct, and eventually you might build exactly that. But it's worth building this version first, exactly as sized here, and living with it for a season before deciding what comes next. You'll learn more about what your home actually needs from a single well-matched $199 system running for a few months than you will from any spec sheet. And that knowledge, not a bigger battery, is what actually determines whether your next build is a smart expansion or an expensive overcorrection. Start small, watch it work, and let the system itself tell you what it's ready to grow into.